and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics of gaming, how they work, and why we love them. I am Mark, and with me today is Anonymous Hippopotamus.
Woohoo! What would you say, the hipponymous?
Hipponymous, yeah, that's right.
The hip-hop anonymous.
The hip-hop anonymous. He's got rhymes that glow like phosphorus.
Yeah, that is an old reference for all you Flight of the Conchord fans out there.
But there are dozens of us. Dozens.
There are dozens. But no, it's an interesting week in that we missed last week, and this week we're talking about time.
That's right. Actually, we recorded this.
See how we did that?
We recorded this in the year 2045.
We're going to release this last week.
Yes.
No, but I think it is interesting in that we the unexplored topics of gaming. Xander was just talking to us about. I was telling Xander last night that we're going to be in time today, and Xander was like, "Geez, you guys we've almost been doing this for a year, Mark."
I know, we're coming up on a year, dude.
We haven't really done a repeat yet. In terms, like we were talking about how that would be okay, even we're allowed to go back and some of these topics, like time, for example, we're not going to freaking say everything we can about time in one hour podcast in video game. I feel like there's been a lot of those we've done. I think that just more speaks to not our creativity, but the beauty of the genre, I guess, and just how creative and cool video games are. That we literally like that unexplored topics in gaming thing. Like, how many unexplored topics are there really? Apparently, a frick ton.
There's a lot.
So yeah, I think I was encouraged by that when Xander was like, "Holy crap, you guys just don't have something to talk about." And I was like, "Yeah, we don't not have something to talk about. That's cool."
We never don't not have anything to say.
That is the easiest way. Yeah, it was the easiest way to compliment a person is to confuse tenses.
So this week we're going to be talking about time, and there are a few different aspects. Okay, there's more than a few. There's a crap ton of stuff we're going to try to cover in this episode.
Yep.
So
we're going to jump around a bit.
Some of it might be very brief in summary, and we might unpack it in later episodes. As Greg said, we reserve the right to revisit time at a later date.
No.
But we're going to start with talking about narrative functions of time, specifically because our previous episode was on tabletop games, and tabletop games have a very flexible relationship to time, and video games generally don't. And this actually has to do a lot with the narrative connection that tabletop games have. They come out of storytelling. They come out of really more of the oral tradition. And video games come more out of a kind of a new thing, more of a pictorial representation, or also a really old thing if you want to think about like hieroglyphs and paintings. But
but those didn't move.
Yeah, that's true.
The idea of like those are temporally locked, right? Like they're done at one point and then they never change. The idea of like moving pictures is, I mean, that's 100-year-old idea tops.
Yeah, it's really pretty new, and we're still trying to figure out how to do a lot of the things that happen naturally in oral and written traditions in these pictorial traditions. And so, let's see, it's hard to call it a tradition after 100 years even, but...
I mean, yeah, I guess we have like animation.
Yeah, that's true.
That goes back a little, but still, even not too much farther back, I mean...
So, in a narrative, it's not unusual to... I remember being in like 4th grade or whatever, and they talk about exploding a moment, right? Like you would zoom in and you would, really be in detail about like a specific moment in time that was significant to the narrative.
And then you destroy the moment.
You literally blow up all the characters.
We learned how to ruin narratives in 4th grade. It's a very advanced storytelling technique.
But then also you have a lot of summary that happens in narrative, right? Where you sort of you say something really quickly, and you just, as a reader, you just are like, okay, that's what happened, right? Like, oh, he traveled to the nether realm. I don't know. I guess if he had been there before, you wouldn't inquire too much as to like, oh, how did he get there?
Ooh. I have a good example. I get to talk about Lord of the Rings on the podcast, which I haven't done that much.
Please do. Give me a real example instead of me making stuff up.
No, great example being Lord of the Rings novels. Those are bizarrely temporal. I mean, bizarrely temporal sounds stupid. They jump a ton in terms of time frames. You have one example being, say, like the longest chapter in the entire book, or the entire series, if you want to think about it as a trilogy, is the Council of Elrond, which is in universe probably like an afternoon tops, a few hours,
Mm-hmm.
and that takes up a like 60 pages worth almost. It's a huge chapter. And it is super, you're in the moment. It's mostly dialogue, it's mostly talking, it's mostly literally like moment to moment. Then you have chapters like right after that, which is The Ring Goes South, which tells the story of basically like almost all of winter in
Mm-hmm.
less pages. And then, so that's the Fellowship going from Rivendell all the way down to Moria, which is like seriously like almost half their journey in terms of like physical distance.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, Moria, which is supposed to be a 3-day thing. So again, the time gets compressed again. So you went from like Council of Elrond being an afternoon to like 5 weeks for the Ring Goes South, and then you're in Moria, and that's a 3-day thing that's stretched over 2 chapters. So Tolkien really I mean, you're absolutely right. It feels very. It's actually that's probably a decent example of it's hard for the reader to even get a semblance of what's happening,
Right.
time wise. And the Lord of the Rings is not too important because at that point you're just focused on the Fellowship and not going on the outer world. So they can do that. And when it comes to when you kind of get a bigger, broader scope of the world in later sections of the novel, I think it does that less. But at the same time, actually, even if I'm a massive Tolkien nerd, including the movies, Peter Jackson's films, which I adore, and they even talk about the fact that trying to build a timeline for the movies, because it is so, a movie does have to happen in time in large part.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually one of the huge challenges for adapting the script was lining everything up and figuring out how to make it all work in an
Mm-hmm.
appropriate way.
Well, I want to come back
So
to
anyway,
that.
that was an example of that.
I want to come back to what you just mentioned about how movies have to happen in time and hear more about what you mean by that. But first,
Yep.
I mentioned the fourth grade thing, not just because it's true, but also because I think it demonstrates how early we really get a mastery of the way that written and oral traditions present time to us.
Sure. Yeah,
That
yeah.
like it's just very natural when someone's telling a story, you're expecting this ebb and flow of time. You're
Yeah.
expecting
Yeah.
for there
Yeah.
to be like a build up when they get to the big moment that they want to share with you, you're expecting for things to slow down.
Yeah. You're
And
not going
like
to gloss over that. Yeah. Exactly.
right, but like the car ride to that moment, you don't expect agonizing detail
Yeah.
because like why you're that's not the part you're interested in, and so you
Yeah.
have
And
this
yeah.
symbiosis between the audience's interest and the presenter's level of detail. And a good
Hmm.
presenter will be able to gauge how interested are people in what I'm talking about and how much detail should I add, or maybe it's just time to wrap this thing up.
Yep.
Right?
Very
And
much so.
so if your audience is getting bored, you're not going to go into agonizing detail. And so
Hmm.
you can, both parties really have the sense of the fluidity of time. And I think it
Hmm.
is very different in movies. Why don't you say more about what you mean when you say movies have to happen in real time?
Well, in that case, I meant, which is not entirely true. Look at movies like Memento, or there's plenty of other movies that deal with time in nonlinear fashions. But in general, for a big blockbuster film that's trying to present this giant narrative, in general, that's going to just have to be, everything's going to have to be happening in order, right? You're not going to be jumping back and forth in time, and in general, so that's in one sense. In a bigger sense, right? Literally, I mean, we've talked about this before, but one big difference between games and movies, or even movies and books, is that you, as the audience, have absolutely no control over the time frame of the entertainment that's happening. Right? In a book, you can literally stop reading and it stops.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose you can like walk out of the movie, and then it stops.
Yeah.
But that's kind of defeating the point here. You can't come back to the movie, like, I mean, unless you've paused. Anyway, point is, in large part for the movie, you are being like time is happening outside of your control in any way, shape, or form. You don't get to
Mm-hmm.
slow down, or speed it up. And so in that regard, when I said like movies have to happen like in time, it is like even your linear experience of time is like a part of the movie, right? Like you as an
Hmm.
audience have to sit there for 2.5 hours or 2 hours or whatever, and you get
Right.
that amount of time in your life to be a part of that movie, and then it's over. And you can think about it, or you can go back and do it again. But like as opposed to a book, that's usually going to be chopped up in a bunch of different places. Games, you can literally get to like advance the storyline or not advance the storyline in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
while you're still playing the game. So yeah, anyway, that's what I meant by the movies seem to be like the simplest version of that, where like you sit down, you watch it all the way through, that's it.
It's
You don't
done.
have almost any interaction with that. And in the case of most narratives, that's the way narrative goes too. Is like yeah, you go from the beginning at one point in time to a later point in time, and that's the end of the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you sort of take it in one shot. Like
Yep.
you don't really usually break up your movie watching into like 30-minute chunks or something, like you would in a
Right.
TV
Right.
show. It's not
Yep. Totally.
episodic.
Totally.
But I actually think that movies suffer from like a tension building standpoint at
Hmm.
not having the access to sort of sub real time. And
Yeah.
I'm going
Yeah.
to say
Totally.
more about that because obviously there are things that you can do to slow down pictorial representations of things. You can do stuff in slow mo, but
Right.
it doesn't really work. Like if you've ever watched somebody like try to have a really dramatic moment where it was just really slow, some movies do that well, but it's not usually done for a prolonged period of time.
Yep.
Whereas if you hear something written out, you fully expect for it to slow down. And like they're talking
Yep.
about the beads of sweat over the person's eyebrow, you're talking about heart rate, you're talking about feeling, and you
Hmm.
go into just very long detail. And for the audience, that moment where you finally open this door that you're not sure if it's going to explode or something like that, right? That
Hmm.
happens in the Matrix. In the Matrix,
Hmm.
that just sort of they build up to that moment, but they have to do it from a much longer time frame because they
Yep.
can't take the 10 seconds while Neo walks toward the door to build up that moment.
Oh,
Like
totally.
they have to take the whole movie to build up that scene because they can't slow it down. Whereas
Yeah.
in a
Very much
book,
so.
you actually could just take those 10 seconds and draw them out for a whole chapter.
Hmm. Yeah, very much. And I feel like games fall into a similar category of movies, actually, in this case more so, where because they're pictorial, you don't get as much ability to give insight without having to stop the entire sequence of events and explain what's going on through narrative. Which I mean, you can also do in movies, but kind of sucks. Usually takes you out of it.
Right.
Games tend to fall into a similar space, at least narratively, where if you are going to be building up to a very very important, impressive, powerful moment in a game. In general, that's going to be something that's shown as opposed to told.
Mm-hmm.
That will require a whole lot of other groundwork having been laid previously to be able to understand intuitively how the characters are feeling, as opposed to being able to really slow down and have a moment, and particularly because you're controlling stuff. Like you actually are the person driving the action in the event. So slowing you down actually is far. I mean, again, within relative, sometimes you have like bullet time stuff, which can be fun. But in general, you wouldn't actually want to play a whole game of slow mo because it's not fun. Like
Right.
that sucks all the tension and the action out of it. And usually, that's actually a power up. Basically, is how to slow down. Like Metal Gear Solid 5, for example, Xander and I've been playing, and you have if you get surprised by an enemy, you do get a certain amount of time where time slows down and gives you time to react. And then time goes back to normal, and you have to fight in real time. But that ability is actually one that you can like upgrade and like give more power to. So it's a very powerful thing,
Mm-hmm.
um, and is not designed to be able to be done perpetually. Right? That's like how people solve like fighting games, right? By going frame by frame and like building like the perfect kind of like Smash does that a lot, right?
Right.
Where you can like go and like get these perfect combos, but literally you do that by slowing time down to the point where it's like frame by frame and you're controlling exactly where everything goes. So at that point, it's not really the game; it's just it's far more. There's not much interactivity to it. Um,
Well, I think that bringing up reaction and reaction time, though, is a really important part of it. Like, when you
yep.
mess with the timing in video games, if you leave it interactive, then you're opening yourself up to having the player have superhuman reaction time, right?
Right.
Like, or if you don't leave it interactive or you somehow limit the interaction, then you just have the player sitting there waiting for the next time when they can actually do something, which
Right.
totally takes them out of being that character. Because
Yeah.
the
Very
character
much.
can do something at all points, right?
Right.
But the character is experiencing time at a different rate than the player. And
Yeah.
so the player may be wanting to do things but at a much faster rate than the character realistically would. And so you
Yeah.
got a
Totally.
separation between those two things that you're trying to actually merge together,
And
especially
that's
if you're trying
interesting.
to build tension.
Yeah, totally. And that's an interesting thing too. Even like you were talking about the difference between characters' time, or at least their experience of time, and the player's experience of the time, being that's a really trippy thing. Like right, even it sounds kind of like heady and difficult to kind of wrap your mind around, and yet it's an extremely normal part of gaming.
And
It's something that happens intuitively, very, very easily, that like we don't even have to think about. But when we do think about it, it's actually like that's a very unique place to be in some ways, where you are like not only is because like you have a different experience of time than characters in movies too, but the difference is you're not controlling those characters.
right.
Being in control of something or a character or a person in a game, and we're talking just like kind of narratively here, right? The characters aren't real things,
Right.
but being able to like interact with them in such a way that you are, your experience of time is far different from theirs. Being able to like do that, it's a very interesting, I feel like a unique thing actually that humans do.
Yeah, I
Like,
can't
I can't
really.
think of any other example where you're like using two different time frames simultaneously in your mind. One, your current one, and two, like the one that you're manipulating, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a
You
really
know,
good point. That is very strange.
and it's very easy for us to put ourselves into that place with that character.
Hmm. Well,
Huh.
especially if the observed time frame is less dense than your experienced time frame,
Yeah,
right? I don't have the research to back that up, but I would imagine if the player you're watching is experienced time at twice the rate that you are, that it would be
right.
very difficult to try to keep up with that.
That's a good point. That's a good point. You're both,
Um,
yeah. At least it's both in real time for you and the character. It's not like
mhm.
like you're playing at one time frame and the character's interacting at another. That would be insane. Where like the game's going at like times two speed, but you input controls at times one, and you have to like figure out how to make those two things line up.
That would be just infuriating, I think, to try and wrap your head around.
Yeah, that's
But I don't know. Maybe some
that's
people would think it's
ridiculous.
fun. I don't think I'd
There's
play
actually a
that
game
game.
like that. Actually, no, this makes me think of a board game that another one of Mark and I's friends have played. It's called, oh crap, what's it called?
Space
It's
Alert? You talking about
yeah,
Space
Space
Alert?
Alert.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
man. Space
yep,
Alert.
yeah. Where that game's fascinating in that you have to line up times happening. Okay, let me just explain the game. It's a
It's
cooperative
hard to
game.
explain.
I know. I'm just like, oh shoot, should I even try? I'll try. It's a cooperative game, so it's you versus the game. And when it start, you're basically on a ship. It's kind of like the game, like we talked about Faster Than Light a few times, which is an awesome game, FTL. Which is kind of this roguelike where you're in command of a ship, spaceship, and you have a crew, and the crew has to interact with different systems on the ship to make sure that everything goes. Someone will be manning the shields, the one person will be manning the engines, one person will be the pilot, so on and so forth. Um, and so this is basically like a board game version of FTL where you have, however many crew members, four or five, and you have this ship that you have to be utilizing as different things happen. And each person will be doing different actions. And what happens is basically you'll start a timer, and there's like a program that goes with it. You have like a computer or like a phone or whatever, and it'll tell you what's happening. Like, hey, like a ship is appearing on this side of, like an enemy ship appears here and attacks you at this point, or like an asteroid's coming this way, or like a solar flare is happening, and you have to react to it. And as it's happening, each person on the team has to be doing actions around the ship to ensure that, say, there's enough power for the weapons to be firing to the new enemy ship that comes into play, or that the shields stay up, or that we're going to maneuver this direction to avoid like an asteroid, that sort of thing. And you do that all in this like 60-second span, so it's all happening in real time, and then it ends, and then you go back and look at as you were doing actions, you're recording the actions. Stuff isn't like actually happening. You're like moving things around. At the
Hmm.
end of the time period, you go back and you look at all the things you did, like the sheet like of actions. Like I said, you record everything you did, and then you line it up with the other people. Like you're trying to communicate during this time. It's very, very difficult because so many things are happening. So
Hmm.
you line it up, and then you see what actually happened. So say like, hey, I pressed this button that's supposed to fire this weapon, but if there wasn't enough like power routed to this weapon that I had done previously, or someone got their timeline messed up and put power there like after I was going to fire the weapon, then the weapon won't fire, and that ship is still there, right?
Right.
So it's hard to. It is really freaking explain.
It's super
Um,
hard to explain.
but it's basically yeah, the way you handle time is super interesting, in that like it's happening in real time, and you're interacting with your fellow humans trying to make sure all the systems work. But then at the end of it, you go backwards and look back over what you did and see if it actually lined up. So you
Right.
are that's an example of what I was trying to talk about in terms of like your interaction with time. Your actions aren't happening in real time. You're trying to line your actions up with like another timeline that's happening. It's hard to explain. It's really hard.
Yeah.
It's basically a game of communication in large part, being able to communicate well enough between your teammates.
Well, you can
Um,
almost think of the first phase of Space Alert as like a hypothetical planning situation. So, if you knew
yeah,
in advance that all of these things were going to happen, what would you do in response? And then you actually
right,
see that play out. But, you sometimes fail to take into account either something that happened or something that somebody else did. And so you
right,
get wires crossed, and then there's, hilarity ensues, and you might lose the
right,
game. But
right.
you find out all three of you went to a segment of the ship that was destroyed, and so nobody actually goes anywhere, and then
Right, exactly. And then you're dead,
everything's
and no
thrown
one
off.
actually did anything afterwards. Yeah, exactly.
But
No. That's anyway. So that was an example. I was just trying to think of the different ways where time there's the only version of a game I could think of where you are interacting with time at a different layer than like the game plays out at.
yeah,
You know.
yeah,
Um,
I wish I could think of a video game example of that, but
well,
I'm
we
sure
could
that there is
use
one.
that to talk about Akron right now.
Well, actually, before we talk about Akron, I want to talk about because we're moving more into a mechanical use of time,
Right.
how time is used as a mechanic in games.
Right.
And just briefly, I want to give a hat tip to the fact that narratives slow down at important moments. Mirrors our experience. So the brain actually does that for you. If you've ever been in a bad car accident, if you've ever had something really intense happen to you, you will experience that moment slower. Your brain sort of goes on overdrive, and this is a pretty well studied phenomenon that your subjective experience of time alters. And so
Yep.
in narrative, you're actually giving the audience that adrenaline rush that the character you're describing would have had. And so you're able to take in all of these words, you're getting all of this sensory and physical information about the world in this moment at an almost unrealistic speed. Right? Because you can read all about this 10 seconds in the narrative for an hour and get all of this context. And in a video game, you really don't get that. Like, there's not a good way to really slow it down and give you that same adrenaline rush.
I mean, other than like I said, even the time slowing down, like Metal Gear Solid's a great example of that, where it temporarily slows down your time to give you this sense of like incredible superhuman reactions.
Yeah.
Other than that, yeah, and certainly narratively, you can't do that, right?
Right.
You can't slow down a cutscene, or you can't slow down a point of heavy like narrative function in a
Right.
game and give you more information. I guess you could if it like you do kind of a Sherlock, like the movie Sherlock with Robert Downey Jr., where like it'll slow down the scene and it'll have him like narrating everything that's about to happen, then it goes back and it'll go and play it out at real time. Something
Yeah.
like that, I guess, would be like one option, but I can't really think of certainly you couldn't do that. That'd be a cutscene. You can't really do that and have any interactivity or control.
Well,
So that's a really good point. I love that.
and like imagine falling off of getting really close or almost falling off a cliff in real life, right? So you'd have
Yeah.
one of those like triggers where everything's slowed down. Now
Yeah.
imagine watching a movie where somebody almost falls off a cliff and they slow it way down. Does it feel
Right.
more dramatic or less dramatic? I would say it feels less dramatic
Sure.
because
Yeah, that's an
like
interesting point.
it's actually like you have as the audience you have full time to like see and process like, oh, he's about to go over that cliff.
Yeah,
It's-
yeah, because you're not in that state as the audience, right? That person
Exactly.
is, but you are being able to comprehend things in real time and are able to like understand. Yeah. No, that's interesting. That's a cool point, and that is a fantastic point. I love that. Like, yeah, that usually with the flooding of adrenaline and all your fight or flight stuff is when that happens. So usually more traumatic moments for humans. But that's very much a survival. I mean, that's a survival mechanism. That's a really cool thing, and that's also begs some really interesting questions to talk about in terms of psychology and yeah, like you said, perception of time and time as a thing that is in fact perceived. But that's not what we're doing right now
Yeah.
necessarily. You can see this episode's been all over the place. I apologize for that, guys. It's just a really interesting topic, and it's huge. And I think we were trying more to just kind of go a bunch of different places, then maybe be able to zero in on some more in future episodes. Kind of more an overview of time as a construct and as a way to interact with things, narratively, and I think this is a decent segue into the most time-based mechanical game that I can think of, being called Akron. I think Akron, maybe. It's just a portmanteau of no time, right? Chrono being time, and then A being negating.
Right.
So it's I don't know exactly if that would be Akron or Akron. But regardless, it is a game. It's an RTS game that is, I think, arguably there's other games that obviously use time as a mechanic. Think Ocarina of Time being probably arguably the most famous. Majora's Mask, of course, does that as well. Prince of Persia: Sands of Time was a big deal. 2003. That was kind of one of the first times you could like move time in real time in a game, like backwards and forwards, and watch things change. But Akron, I'm just going to call it Akron, is arguably the most, I think the most complicated, maybe the most advanced. Have we mentioned it on stream before, Mark?
No, we haven't.
We haven't talked about this at all, huh?
No.
Good Lord.
It's like the oh shoot, what's that movie? The movie where they travel all over the place. Primer. It's like the Primer of video games.
I don't know that movie.
You haven't seen Primer? Okay. Well, they mess with time
in
Primer. Anyway.
Yeah, it was. I remember when this was kind of I was huge into the RTS scene back when there was an RTS scene, and oh boy, this was probably the early 2010s, but if not 2010 itself, it was basically it's a game that so it's RTS in all the normal ways and is three-dimensional in that regard, except for the fact that you have a mini map. Which could be thought of as like this big, huge. You basically have a mini map for time. You have a timeline at the bottom of the game, and you can move through time at any point. In large part, time is a resource. You have a meter that allows you to manipulate time, so you can't just do it indefinitely. Sending a unit through time, the bigger the unit is, or the farther in time, uses more of this resource. But so you can both send units through time as well as jump through time as a player. So it's pretty crazy. Again, it's something you just have to look up. Achron, Akron. I don't even know how to begin explaining it. Really, the most notable thing about it, I think, is the fact that it deals with even games like Ocarina or Prince of Persia. Chrono Trigger, right? Or games that use it a little bit more simply as a narrative device, like Jack 2, the game Infamous. There's all kinds of problems that come when you begin manipulating time in terms of paradoxes, and the grandfather paradox being the most famous one, right? If you go back in time, kill your grandfather, do you cease to exist? Or how does that work? And Akron basically was built as a system that could deal with all of those. It does utilize. Should I even go into explaining this, Mark? Do you have any thoughts on this game? I could just keep on talking about it.
Yeah, I think if you could explain it, I don't know how in-depth of an explanation you're thinking of, but briefly how they would resolve something like the grandfather paradox would be interesting.
Okay, so the way they do this, so they did add a new thing too, which is basically time. So the way they dealt with paradoxes is they have these things called time waves that propagate across the timeline. So basically, I forget how often it is, once every maybe 15 or 30 seconds, a time wave will come out, and it will, across, like, think of the timeline as a literal linear timeline, which you see. It'll start at the beginning of it and propagate all the way out through what's happened throughout the timeline. And basically, this timeline is like a change line. So it'll take whatever has been altered in those early times and propagate that change out across the timeline as it moves. So you can see this, like I said, it's on you can see the timeline at all times as a player, and this wave literally looks like a wave that goes across the line, and it will change all the things. So in this case, if you go back in time, say you have a factory and it produces a tank, and you go back in time and destroy the factory that made the tank, that tank will exist in the game world until that time wave crosses over that point in the line, in which point it will evaporate. It'll disappear, right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't change everything in real time. I think that's like almost impossible to simulate at this point, but it does use those time waves to propagate stuff out. Now, the kicker is that there is another version. There's another paradox that goes, basically there's a way that you can use a unit to destroy something. If you use the unit to destroy the thing that it made it, then suddenly you have this double paradox where you can't destroy the thing because the tank wouldn't have been produced by the unit to go back in time, but at the same time, something destroyed this factory. So what they do there is that they alternate, actually, until that creates like a time loop. And that can be, and I forget exactly how, but that can be resolved. What they do is with the timelines, that would like you could create two separate timelines. Obviously, for a game, you can't quite do that. And so what they do is with that time wave propagating out, every other time wave will switch the timeline. So it'll switch between the tank being alive and the factory being alive until that paradox gets resolved. So like I said, this is hard to even describe, much less begin thinking about this in terms of like strategy or like competitive. It should put into context. I think this is arguably the most intensive time-based game that I've found. But it's cool in that it does actually give these through the time wave kind of thing as it corrects and updates. There's a whole section of the game's website that goes through each one of the time paradoxes and how it deals with it. And it's quite brilliant. It's quite incredible, honestly. I mean, the fact that it's really more. I feel like it's less a game and more just like a time simulation, like a time manipulator. Like I think it's less about killing your enemy and more about like being able to figure out, just experiment all the different ways that you can play with time. It's a brilliant system.
Which is a very different take on an RTS, right? I mean, to not
totally.
have the focus be strategizing against your opponent, but how to use this really alien technology of manipulating time.
Yeah, totally. And that it is, I feel like, one of the first things that it does feel alien. It feels it's a completely different mindset in terms of the way you're thinking. Obviously, because we are, at this point, temporal creatures, locked in time. Being able to think outside of that is even in very, arguably simple ways, is a super, super difficult thing. So anyway, that's just more, I just want to at least, I feel like doing an episode on time without talking about Akron. We could do an entire episode on Akron, I feel like.
Yeah, we could. We could maybe we could do a
stream that, man.
Yeah, stream Akron. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
But the question burning in my mind is, what is the speed of wave propagation?
Yeah, I think it's variable. I think you can set it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, like within, like I think there might be a standard for like competitive mode, but that speed of the propagation, you're absolutely right. That matters a ton. And I think like you said, it's editable. Because if it's super slow, right, then you can do all, like, the game would just change to an, like, almost a random state, like almost incoherent. If you did it every, like, 5 minutes and you have people going back and changing stuff, then when it comes all across, like, it would be impossible to keep track of all the things that are going to change. If you do it at, like, 0.1 second, that begins to approach, like I said, that real time. Maybe, I doubt the system would be able to do that fast. I'm unclear, but like I said, I think the normal set is like 15 to 30 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Of the time waves propagating out.
Well, that's certainly a very trippy use of time manipulation. We're only going to scale back from there. That's the worst one.
Yeah,
so if you feel lost, we'll try to get you back involved with the conversation.
You're not entirely alone, actually.
Yeah. Probably the second worst one on our list would be, I actually haven't played Prince of Persia, but Super Time Force is pretty trippy in that, like...
Oh yeah, talk about that.
So what happens in Super Time Force is you play a normal run and gun forward, okay? So you've got characters that have different types of guns, rocket launchers, one guy has a shield, some guys just have a machine gun. And if your character dies, then you have to choose a point in the timeline where you're going to go back to. And so, and if you go back 10 seconds, you'll appear where your character was 10 seconds before you died. And your character actually will, the one that you previously played and died, that life will play forward with you, and you'll also play as a new character. And so there could be 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how many times you've died in a spot, playing forward through this part of the level. And if you manage to prevent your previous death, then you get that life back. And so you have this really weird interaction where the more times you die in a segment, the more help you actually get with that segment, because now there are, 5 or 6 of you all trying to do this same fight. And, when you finally succeed at that part, you get rewarded in a big way if you prevent a lot of deaths. And so it's really this like build-up of assistance and help, and then a big payoff once you get it. And I think it's really satisfying.
Well, and the interesting thing about that game too is that the levels are designed to not be able to be beaten on the first point, right? Like it's designed to be able to require you to go back and have multiple versions of yourself be doing things. Which is also interesting because then that like you're talking about I love the life mechanic too, because you can either A, just try to like problem solve and figure out like, okay, treat yourself as semi expendable and be like, okay, what's the easiest way to make sure that like this goal gets completed. Or you can do that along with, okay, how do I, with all these little sub goals, which is like, okay, how do I do this and ensure that this death doesn't happen in the same way there? And then repeat that out like 3 or 4 times. Suddenly you have a lot of things that you're juggling immediately on your plate as a player, which is nice. I mean, it's a very simple game mechanically, right? Otherwise, it's pretty simple, run gun. But past that, it suddenly becomes these incredibly complex problem-solving situations. I feel like I've been trying to think more a general statement in terms of like time manipulation in games, and I feel like it is really like Akron as a game, even in terms of like the RTS function of it, or like the factions are pretty darn simple. They're not too many advanced abilities or super different, like I don't know. It's not comparable to like say StarCraft or StarCraft 2 in terms of that's not where the depth from the game comes from. It's
right.
Simple pieces with a super deep system, similar to like Time Troopers. Like it's very much a simple game with a cool system to it that suddenly becomes incredibly complex.
Right.
Because it kind of compounds upon itself.
Kind of like chess, right? It doesn't take that long to explain to somebody how all the pieces move, but you know, you can spend your whole life learning chess.
Yeah. That's interesting because chess doesn't seem like it should be one of those.
Yeah, you wouldn't think so.
But
because there's nothing really...
Sorry, Super Time Force, not Time Troopers. That's different.
Yes, so. Yeah. Is Time Troopers a game?
I don't know. I don't know where I got that from.
Well, anyway, Super Time Force, pretty cool game. Not as mind-bending as Akron, but still you get a little taste of that. It takes a second to adjust to, the things that I do will have permanent ramifications even when I rewind. And go back in time and even if I start the level over again, I'll still have this other guy traveling with me.
Which, speaking of that dynamic, that kind of just makes me think of Ocarina, in terms of that, even more simplified version of that, which is, hey, if I do this one thing in the past or in the future, if I plant a tree in the past and I go to the future, it'll be there. There's a very one-to-one sense. There's only the 2 time frames, but still, what you do in each one will affect the other. Or is it really? It's really more just. Well, I guess it goes both ways, doesn't it? In general, it tends to be more you do something in the past and to then take advantage of that in the future, right?
Yeah, that's usually.
As opposed to going backwards, it's more like trying to. I mean, obviously, at the end, like being able to undo the bad future works backwards. But in general, Ocarina is a more simple version of that.
Yeah, because you just have the 2 timelines you're working with, and causality is really only flowing in that one direction.
Exactly.
It's a lot easier to figure out what to do next.
Right. And in that same realm of like, as we were talking about, kind of the idea of complexity, like a simple system. Ocarina is not a simple system. It's actually a very huge, very complex system by itself.
Right.
So hence the time portion of it is essentially simplified because there's so many other things to do in the game.
Right.
It doesn't need this really, really, really complex time manipulation system to make it interesting. It's interesting by itself.
Which is, I think, a cool.
Kind of on top of it.
I think it's a cool note on just like game design in general. Is like you really don't want to overwhelm your player with complexity. Like,
totally.
You want the game to be approachable and just straight up intimidating.
And I think one of the reasons Ocarina is so well loved is that it hit an unbelievable like compromise point between those two of this really cool, really brilliant complexity, as well as being a Zelda game. It's Nintendo. I mean, Nintendo's notorious for that, being able to combine extreme depth with extreme usability.
So one thing that I also wanted to talk about was like sim type games and how they use time.
Oh yeah. SimCity, baby.
And RTSs too actually also share this, but so for example, actually RTS is kind of a clearer split actually in my head, where the units you're controlling always move in real time, but most of the things that you build don't happen in real time, right? I mean, you can't actually build a factory or a barracks in less than a minute, but on most RTS games you can. And so they're actually, time is sort of flowing at 2 different rates
Hmm.
You can think of it that way. I've never really thought of it that way, but that you actually, if you think about how time is flowing in this little area that's constructing a factory, it's happening much faster.
Well, that's another example I think of like these super intuitive. Like no one, I'd never thought of that before I was thinking about this episode, or even you brought that example up. But because it is oddly so intuitive, but it's actually a very strange thing at the end of the day, right? That we're interacting with two time flows and it feels super normal. Like there's no other example of that in. I can't think of any other example of that in like human experience necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Of like, yeah, that does feel like it should. You think that even like evolutionarily, that should be something difficult for us to wrap our minds around because we're so temporally bound. But for some reason, it's a super easy thing to comprehend. Like, oh yeah, no, like we'll speed time. Like even in like think I'm thinking of like Command and Conquer or Red Alert, where when you build a building, it's on a sidebar, you construct it, it's done, then you place it, and it immediately constructs. There's an animation for it, right? It like comes out of the ground and like immediately like materializes, and
Mm-hmm.
like obviously we recognize that's not the way that works, but it's not this horribly confusing like it doesn't throw the player out. It doesn't completely change the way that you think about the game. Like it's I don't know, it's a very intuitive thing, and that's true across all of these games.
Well, if I think, and this is getting a little into the weeds, but if I think experientially about a process like that, it's not that different than driving to a place you've never been and seeing a city there, right?
Sure,
From your
sure,
perspective, that city appears instantaneously.
yeah,
But, even though you're not aware of the decades it took to build every building in that city, it
right,
just
right,
appears. And so it's sort of like that experience.
yeah, yeah. And that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, I guess yeah, that's a good point. That maybe that's why it doesn't like completely just blow our minds every time it happens because you're right. There's some level of like we the world around us exists without us seeing every step of it,
Right.
and that doesn't blow our minds every single time. Anyway, that was just an interesting thought. Anyway, go back to what you were talking about. How yeah, that in terms of RTS games, but sim games too.
Yeah, so sim games like and for Sims actually it has a bit more of a I think there's even more going on with sim games because you've got more parts of in detail that you're simulating.
Right.
So you might be simulating a bus route, and you might be simulating like people's commutes if you're playing
Right.
a game like City Skylines.
Right.
You might be simulating, the building of buildings. Let's see, what other things do you get to simulate in those things?
In relationships, like
Yeah,
if you think about The Sims as it is, or like people growing up,
you're going to have like a landfill
human
that's
time
filling at a
spans,
specific rate. Yeah, you're going to
sure,
have like human lives going on in front of
resources
you.
being depleted.
And so, like, you're dealing with all of these different things that are happening that are. So, the game is trying to communicate something to you in real time, but also there's a lot of, like, summaries going on.
Mhm.
So, like,
Yeah.
you don't actually see the bus doing its route at, like, hundreds of times a minute.
Mhm.
But it still has to convey a sense of, like, the bus goes here, then it goes here, then it goes here, but also this building is being built from nothing in like that same
Mhm.
amount of time,
Yeah.
which is really weird. Or like this road is being extended just like whenever you click, boom, now there's road there.
Right. Yeah, totally. I mean, there's another interesting version of this in like even the Age of Empires games, which one of the dynamics, like the technology, the tech tree mechanically in the game is actually like time based. So like to move on to new types of units, you literally have to like go into a new age, right? From like the Stone Age to the Iron Age to the Bronze Age. I think that's
Yeah,
backwards. Pretty sure
yeah,
it's
that would
Stone to
be
Bronze
backward.
to Iron.
Yep.
Um, but anyway, point is, it's that's again like just another a far more simple one, right? Like time doesn't actually advance for you and not your opponent, but at the same time, brings you to these weird places where like yeah, this is this semblance of you're advancing through this technological age at this point, and it might take longer to do that, or it might take shorter amount of time to do that than say like building a farm, which is slightly backwards. And yet that's totally, that's just it's within the system of the game, super understood, completely
Yeah.
intuitive.
Hmm.
The sim game one's interesting because those games are literally just, there's no, as opposed to like RTS games where you're usually playing against another player or someone trying to beat you. In a sim game, it's all just you. You're just alone.
Right.
So time doesn't have to be like a thing that has to line up with anyone, really. With like I said, with those RTS games, at least that experience of time has to be equal on both players' sides, so it's still competitive. Unless you're accurate, apparently. I don't know.
Well,
but
and
with a sim game, you know, kind of pick and choose where time goes.
And thinking about like money flow and things like that, like if you think about how much a city makes in a year, when do you realize that in city timeline? Like when do
Yeah.
you actually make
Yeah,
that
when's
much
that
money?
coming?
If you were to actually look at the flow of income for you as
Mhm.
a city planner or whatever,
Right.
that would be a way to judge time, right? It's like how long does it take for me to make an average amount of money?
Right.
That would be considered 1 year.
Right.
But if you were to look at something else, like how long does it take for the bus to complete its route, that could be the definition of 1 day. Or if you looked at how long does it take to construct your average building, and you look to see how long it takes in game, you could use that as a time a reference for time frame. And all of
Totally.
those would give you different ideas of how fast what you're watching on screen is actually moving.
Yeah.
But it's not actually confusing for you as a player.
hmm Yeah, no, that speaks again to the like kind of immense amount of information that can be conveyed. I do like that. Like even like you could just kind of play a spreadsheet game like that, that shows all of these different numbers moving and just being a large system based game, which is really what it is under all the UI. But at the same time, you also have all the animations and the movement and like you said, what the screen is showing you, which is a big part of the reason to play games to be able to see stuff. Turns out, and those two things interact quite beautifully. I mean, depending on the game, right? People hated SimCity 20. What was that, like 2012 or something like that?
Right. But had nothing to do with the sense of time, I don't think.
I don't believe so. I don't think that was the reason people hated that game. No, that was the golden age of people being pissed about DMR.
Okay, so we're going to move on from mechanical time to subjective time and the relationship of timing to the player. But I do want to mention
So
one other...
are we going to do that though? Because we have like 10 minutes.
Okay, all right. We don't necessarily have to do that. We could do that in different
Well, no,
episodes.
I was actually legitimately wondering. I mean, I think that could be its own thing, even.
Yeah, no, it could.
Particularly when it comes to like talking about like competitive games or like FPSs, that stuff. Like time is a limiting mechanic, and
Yeah. Okay, yeah, we can wait on that. I think that'd be good.
I think that'd be a good one for another time.
Okay,
I was gonna say
well
we could talk about. We could end just kind of by talking about like Eve and time rating as like limiters, scarcity creators, and then like mobile gaming kind of.
Okay, yeah, I'd be good with that.
How's that sound?
That sounds good. Let's do it.
So yeah, that whole like kind of spreadsheet mechanic, or like the idea of having multiple things happening off screen while there's other things happening on screen, makes me think of mostly. I mean, just even the line spreadsheet tends to make people think of Eve Online. It's very often been called Excel, the game.
Yes, you can't think about spreadsheets for too long without thinking about Eve.
Without thinking about Eve, yeah. We really can't get to many things without thinking about Eve at some point. It's quite a remarkable space. But it's interesting. So the way that time gets used in MMOs, I think Eve's a great example of this in general, just because it's so long span and time based and kind of far more meta than say like World of Warcraft, where you don't want to be waiting for things to take hours and days to build. But in Eve, everything takes. I mean, when you create a new piece, when you set a mining date, when you try to research something, those actions will take hours to days to weeks in the case of the largest ships, the Titans, and certainly trying to build the space stations. That's a week-long endeavor. But that's an interesting thing in that suddenly we have time. We've been talking about the way that time gets dilated most of the time for games, and the ways that our narrative can change in order to keep the player kind of interested and not bored. At the same time, Eve does not care about that.
Nope.
That is not the goal for that game. In fact, the goal is something very different. In this case, it's using time as a resource, basically, or as a rate limiter, scarcity creator. And that is something you see far more in common with MMOs. In general, I think Eve's the arguably probably the ultimate version of that, just because of the way the game is set up, being so PvP based. But it's a really interesting place that we haven't really touched on yet, which is time being specifically used as a resource.
Yeah, well, and I think that's how it works in real life too, right?
Exactly.
It's like, what is the reason we don't all have beautiful, ornate wooden tables? Well, because it's not because we don't have enough wood, right? It's because we don't have enough
Right.
time to make that for
Yeah,
everybody.
or time to learn the skill. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so and I think that Eve borrows heavily from real life in a number of ways, specifically with the,
Right.
the economy. But the economy and the use of time and the way that all that relates to scarcity is very tied together. And so
Totally.
I think Eve, I don't haven't thought about this long enough to say this like with a ton of confidence, but I think it kind of had to be done this way, where time was the other resource, right? You've got your ISK, but then if you aren't making things scarce by making them take a lot of time, then the ISK will just sort of inflate at sort of kind of crazy rates, would be my guess.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the problems with normal currency as well, or the economy in and of itself, as like automation becomes a thing and processes become more and more
Right.
efficient.
Either your
Um,
currency will inflate or your items will just be completely devalued, right? Like
Exactly.
if Titans could be built in 15 minutes instead of 8 weeks, they would be a lot less valuable.
Oh, totally. As well as the fact that like we're again talking about Eve being very, very realistic, but at the same time, it is a game, and there is a level of unlimited resources to an extent, right? The game will never end because they like ran out of resources in the game world, and they're like, oh, sorry, like, I guess you can try to find a new galaxy or something, but for this one, we're pretty much like we mined everything out. We didn't find a reusable economy. Like that's not that's never going to happen in the game, as opposed
Right.
to real life. That can definitely happen.
That's true. In Eve, if you take like multiple days to like learn a skill, right? That's not unrealistic. I mean, it is unrealistic for you to actually learn a skill in a
There
few
we go.
days. But it's also used to
Correct.
sort of motivate the player to go do something else. Like, and I don't even mean like stop playing Eve, but just it sort of just happens in the background, but you like have to wait for it, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's not anything too profound, but like. That's interesting. I don't know of too many other games that are just like, okay, that will happen in a couple of days. Go ahead and do whatever else you want to do.
All right. So I mean, yeah, and we've been talking about that in terms of the like necessity for the game system and the world and the consistency and something that makes Eve really cool. But at the same time, there's also something to think about, which is when we see these things that are super time based, you tend to only ever see those in games that are monetized via time, right? Like, basically MMOs and mobile games are what I'm thinking of, are the places where time tends to be a big, huge factor in the game world itself.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just coincidence, but I sincerely doubt it, that those are the only types of games that are monetized via subscription in large part, or rather, for mobile games, time being something that you can like purchase, like unlock.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Mobile games definitely do what I was describing, where it's like you'll
Right.
build something and then it'll say like, okay, come back in 2 days or whatever, and that'll be done.
Right.
Or you can
Right.
build another building.
Because they're usually ad based, and the more time you spend is the more time that they get to sell you things via ads, and that's money for them. So there is a strictly there is a completely strictly economic focus on those games too. In terms of like, yeah, no, they do need to make money, and one way to do that is to ensure that you keep on coming back for more, and so on and so forth. Which I think kind of runs into our continual question of why game companies want people to keep on playing their games. Like, user base is such a valuable resource to them.
Right.
That's the simplest answer, which is money. But
Right. And for those games, I get it, right? I mean,
Totally.
so
Oh, yeah.
we're not going to beat a dead horse, but like, for games that like are making money off of advertising in their game, of course they want to retain players. That's where they make their money. But for a
Right.
game like Shadow of War, why do they
Right,
care how
or
many
like-
hours you've spent playing?
yeah, or like no, The Witcher, that sort of
Right.
thing.
But anyway.
Well, we don't know. That's one story short on that one. That's
Yes, we've gone over
we're
this
confused by
before.
Yep.
When we figure it out, we will do an episode on that.
that. Yeah, exactly. Oh, dude, we'll do a month on that. No, we won't. But that's
October.
probably a really simple thing that we just overlooked.
But I think having things take extra time as a punishment or as a cost is an interesting idea. And
Ooh, good lead in.
I wasn't going anywhere specific with that, but
Okay.
but yeah,
I
having
will.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, that idea, basically using time as a game mechanic, not in terms of something to manipulate, but just as a punishment or a lockout, We've been talking about it in terms of with the more like certainly Eve's economy based, so using it to create scarcity seems to make a lot of sense. That being said, in games, and this is what we're going to touch on, hopefully either next week or at some point in the future, there's a whole other realm of the way to use time and space particularly. But the way we were thinking about it was in large part even first-person shooters, right? Competitive games, being killed, needing to have some semblance of lockout or some punishment for a fail state, and having that be time in a game, a competitive game like Counter-Strike or like a MOBA, is another very interesting thing that you can talk about in terms of the way that it's going to be used, how you begin to create those timings, and then even how the type of game and the space of the game, the game position, makes a difference in the way the time gets used there. How to use lockouts or respawn times well in competitive games. It's a really interesting conversation.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually we're going to leave it in large part. That's the most concrete place we've been, I feel like, this entire episode. And we were going to try to hit that, but I think it's going to require more time to actually do well, because that is a really cool conversation of time and space in competitive games. But for now, I hope this has been at least an interesting episode. If not, maybe one that was too informative. Maybe it got you thinking about different things or some of your favorite games and the way that they utilize time, either as a mechanic or as a resource, or just the amount of time that you spend playing games and thinking about them, and how that matters to your life. If you want to go all the way up the tree. But in any case, we will be back next week with something, I'm sure. I don't know if it'll be this episode or a different one.
We will talk to you another time. If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics or Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.